The Last Supper. Jesus sits with his disciples one last time. Before, he had explained to them many times what was to follow, but they still don't quite understand. He breaks bread with them, shares the wine, and then he announces to his most devoted followers that one of them will betray him. It has to happen like this, inevitably. Even if you don't know much about art, you've probably already seen a picture of Da Vinci's Last Supper, maybe just printed on a coffee mug. This fresco is one of the most recognizable works in the history of art. Thanks to a rather successful book and its film adaptation, many people believe in secret messages that Da Vinci is said to have hidden in this painting. These include the idea that the person sitting right next to Jesus is not one of the 12 apostles at all, but actually Mary Magdalene. Well, who knows? For this video at least, let's stick to the traditional reading of the subject. This says that the disciple sitting next to Jesus can be identified as the Apostle John. By following John's story, this path will lead us to secrets of our own, far beyond Dan Brown's codes and symbols, secrets of heaven itself. To get there, we have to block out all the noise, the many questions of the desperate disciples at the table, the shock, the confusion, and we have to get closer, closer, closer. We try to imagine being John until we suddenly hear, The magnificent painting you are looking at was painted by Plautilla Nelli, a female Renaissance artist of the 16th century, and that is very appropriate. Because although Dan Brown was probably wrong and there are no women in Da Vinci's Last Supper, this is still a video in which women play the main role. Let's stay with the painting for a moment to understand how extraordinary it is. Nelli entered a Dominican convent in Florence at the age of 14, where she received a higher education. Starting with small book illuminations, she taught herself to paint. She also maintained a painting workshop run exclusively by women, and was able to secure economic independence through the successful sale of her works to the nobility. Although Giorgio Vasari mentions her in his famous Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, she was nevertheless forgotten by art history in the centuries that followed. The Last Supper, painted in 1560, has become her most famous work. Not only was it very unusual for a woman of the time to execute large-scale works, it is probably the first and only depiction of this subject ever painted by a Renaissance woman, and it was most likely influenced by, you guessed it, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. But think about this. Because it was not possible for nuns to study male anatomy, it is assumed that, unlike in Da Vinci's fresco, a woman is actually depicted here in some way. Because Nelli probably used nuns as models for her figures, and with this image in mind, we continue on our way. Every time you see a depiction of the Last Supper and it's outside an art gallery, chances are you're inside monastery walls. Why is that? Because these paintings were made for a very specific purpose. You see, a refectory is the dining room in a monastery where nuns or monks eat their meals together, often in silence, communicating only by hand signals. As the shared meal is of great importance in monastic life, special attention is paid to the artistic decoration of these rooms. After all, a refectory is nothing less than a room of immense spiritual importance. Every single meal eaten here is a reminder of the Last Supper. With the subject of the Last Supper on the wall, the monks and nuns find themselves right among the apostles and in the presence of Christ. Above all, it is the hunger of the soul that needs to be satisfied. Or as it says in Matthew chapter 4, verse 4, "Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes out of the mouth of God." And so, in addition, passages from the Bible are usually read aloud during the meal. And one particular passage in the Gospel of John, when Jesus predicts his betrayal, leads us to the topic of this episode. John chapter 13, verse 21. "Truly, truly, I say to you that one of you will betray me." The disciples began looking at one another, at a loss to know of which one he was speaking. Lying back on Jesus' chest was one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved. Now, it's important to mention that the Gospel of John tells us several times that Jesus loves all of his disciples, and much could be said about the extent to which this anonymous disciple had a special status, or not. There are also a variety of theories as to who this disciple whom Jesus loved could be identified with. For our purposes, two things are relevant. Firstly, the tradition long upheld by the Church. As already mentioned, this equates the disciple whom Jesus loved with the Apostle John, and this in turn with John the Evangelist, just as it is depicted in the paintings we have seen. Secondly, the interpretation that this anonymous disciple represents an ideal type, a symbol, an example that everyone can identify with. Remember when I said at the beginning of the video, we are trying to imagine being John? Well, here we are. And there was one group in history that made particular use of this offer. In the German language, as is so often the case, there is a specific word for the disciple whom Jesus loved, Lieblingsjünger, literally, favorite disciple. Let's stick with this expression, because Germany is the next stop on our journey. More precisely, Southwest Germany, the cultural region of Swabia. This is Heiligkreuztal Monastery, a former convent of the Cistercian order, and it holds a treasure. Carved from walnut wood around the year 1320, this sculpture is 101 centimeters high and 65 centimeters wide. What does it show? It again shows John resting on the chest of Christ at the Last Supper. But the two are removed from the situation. No other disciples, no table, nothing but peace and love, timeless unity. Jesus bows his head slightly towards John, his hand on his shoulder. John has closed his eyes. The subject of the so-called Christ and John groups appear to be unique to the Swabian area. The unknown master of the Heiligkreuztal sculpture probably had his workshop in Constance, situated on the lake of the same name, about 100 kilometers from Heiligkreuztal. Only a few sculptures of this particular type have survived. In total, only around 40 Christ and John groups are still known today and are now spread all over the world. It is a real stroke of luck that the Christ and John group from Heiligkreuztal has remained in this place, undamaged for 700 years. Another, even older example was probably crafted in Zweifelten, not more than 10 kilometers away from Heiligkreuztal. This sculpture is now in the Cleveland Museum of Art. The sculptures vary in size and in some details, but they all have a common message. You can be John. Just immerse yourself long enough and deep enough in this sculpture. Give yourself to Christ in complete trust, and you will have a very personal experience of God. Curiously, these particular Andachtsbilder, devotional images, almost all date from the 14th century, and almost all come from a specific, limited geographical area. But what is even more interesting, and here comes the twist in the story, is that a striking number are found in women's monasteries. And the reason for this leads us to the next and final rung on our ladder to heavenly secrets. As we have seen, Christ and John groups were used for devotion and meditation, but there is more to it. In biblical understanding, this sculpture can also be understood as the bond between bride and bridegroom. Christ is the bridegroom, and the church, represented by his favorite disciple, the bride. Or, more generally speaking, it is a representation of the ideal type of lovers. And it was precisely in women's convents that this idea gave impetus to a movement that we know as mysticism. Try to follow me on this. At a very specific time in history, God walked the earth. And although he was God, he had a body of flesh and blood, a body that could be touched, a body that could be hurt. This is at the very core of the Christian faith. John, for example, as he rested on the Lord's chest, certainly heard a heart beating, a human heart. But what else did he hear? What did he see when he closed his eyes? Visions of the kingdom of heaven at the end of time? The ascension of Jesus marks the end of God's direct physical presence on earth, and at the same time, the ascension is the starting point of mysticism. How so? Think about it. What is Christian mysticism in its very essence? It is the burning desire to want to re-establish closeness to God. And this, according to the idea of mysticism, can only be achieved through deep inner experience. And if it is possible for you, by the grace of God, to climb the highest rung on the ladder of mysticism, to experience closeness to God in its highest form of intensity, then you have achieved unification, the Unio Mystica. That being said, one thing is important to emphasize, namely that mystics are aware of their deep distance from God, despite all their striving for unity. After all, this is what the word holy actually means, being set apart in an unimaginable way. After their experiences, no matter how heavenly they may be, mystics always return to their old existence. It should also be mentioned that mysticism, with its emphasis on individual experience, has always been accompanied by skepticism and has often been suspected of undermining official Christian doctrine. And yet, it has played a formative, inspiring role in the history of Christianity. You may not realize it, but there is a book by Mark Twain that he himself considered to be his greatest achievement, and which he claimed to have worked harder on than any of his other books. Although it lacks much of Twain's characteristic humor, it is still worth reading. In Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc, Mark Twain recounts the life of Joan of Arc, famously one of the greatest mystics of all time. In the scene when Joan of Arc stands before the scrutinizing men of God, scholarly theologians who are trying to defeat her with arguments, Twain has her say, "Listen, the book of God is worth more than all these ye cite, and I stand upon it. And I tell ye there are things in that book that not one among ye can read, with all your learning." What an eerie statement. An abyss opens up, throwing almost all theological reflection overboard in one fell swoop. The mysterious book of God, which, after the Virgin of Orleans, no priest has ever been allowed to look into, is of course about the mystical life. As mentioned at the beginning of this video, women are at the center of this story. It is a peculiarity of medieval culture that so many pious women not only had outstanding experiences of Christ, but also increasingly began to write down descriptions of precisely these experiences. This gave rise to a veritable production of mystical literature. Writing about what one cannot actually write about becomes a characteristic of women's mysticism in Dominican convents in southern Germany and Switzerland. One monastery stands out in particular. Located not far from the city of Nuremberg in Bavaria, the Engelthal convent flourished in the 14th century, a center of mystical practice and literary production. The Dominican nuns who lived here practiced strict asceticism, even self-mortification, and experienced states of rapture and encounters with Christ through meditation and devotion. At the age of 12, a girl entered the convent, attracted by the spiritual life there. Christine Ebner, born on a Good Friday, was a member of one of the oldest and most influential patrician families in the region, and soon after entering the convent, Christine, who lived a strictly ascetic life and was plagued by a recurring illness, experienced numerous visions. Encouraged by her confessor, Christine Ebner began to write down her mystical experiences in 1317. Not in Latin, however, but in German. This made her not only one of the most important representatives of 14th century mysticism, but also one of the first female authors in the German language. The plague was rampant in Europe during these years, the Black Death. In what is now Germany, it is estimated that 1 in 10 inhabitants died during this pandemic. Nuremberg was one of the cities in which a very high proportion of the population died. Processions of flagellants marched through the streets with torches. The judgment of God seemed to have come. But by this time, Christine Ebner had already moved away from the various forms of bloody asceticism. She had seen a different God. In her writings, she developed the image of a loving and gracious God who was turned towards people, as close as Christ is to John. So, the next time you see a depiction of the Last Supper, even if it's just on your coffee mug, forget Dan Brown for a moment. Try this instead. Close your eyes, put your ear as close as you can, and get very quiet until you hear. Thank you for watching.